Love questions lost at sea, lost and unanswered. So much autumn rainfall.
Hello, everybody. I guess we can get lights again if someone can find that. Thank you. My name is Sam O'Connor, and I'm with Theatre Nohgaku. And I decided, because Francois did such a wonderful job sequencing his presentation so that he was preparing us for the viewing, that you were already ready for a viewing. So I thought I would start with a short selection of what No in English might look like if you have a full No on the No stage. But before I go any further, I have to say thank you so much to Professor Lim and her colleagues and students and staff And a big thank you to Amethy for all of her help and for saving my butt over the break, and also the technician, whose name I never even learned. Very good. But thank you so much. So, now I seem to have lost. Oh, I see, no wonder. Good. So we're going to talk about No in English, and there's a couple of things I want to accomplish in this first half of the day. First of all, the first half, you can see that we have a long program here. First half of the program, we're dealing with basically the why and how of English No, the mission statement of the company Theatre Nohgaku, and how Theatre Nohgaku's work is attempting to be different from other groups and artists who have appropriated or borrowed from or been inspired by classical Japanese theater in the past. And then we're going to go on to actually some of the nuts and bolts problems that we face as a company and how we resolve them. Laura, who's sitting over there, is going to talk about training, which is a really fundamental thing. You'll see why, I hope, by the end of my short presentation. And Rick is going to go into much greater detail in an aspect of composition, which is another problem. How do you do English No? You have to make them first, right? So that's basically the structure of this first half. The second half we'll have 3 different accounts of participating in a project. John's is actually taken from a scholarly paper and that he's written, and both Elizabeth and Gary are going to give more personal journeys through the process of developing a work of English No. So, with all that said, I should have had that up before, but you have that in your program, basically. So, No. To begin with, I think everybody pretty much has a strong idea, but allow me just to speak some things that are obvious. The word No, etymologically, it means accomplishment, which implies something about the necessity of virtuosity, at least as a goal of performers, that you don't really have a No unless you have that aspiration toward virtuosity. You can't just and I don't mean any offenses, but you can't just do something in the No style if you haven't made any attempt to really get the actual techniques of No in your body. I think that probably goes without saying for most people in the room, but I think it's worth saying just in case. So, in terms of what No is, I'm going to ask that question in 2 different ways. And one way is, how is it practiced? And these are things that actually, these are all 3 things that kind of surprised me when I first encountered No firsthand, because they sort of debunked assumptions I had about the art a long time ago. One is that I always thought it was a classical theater, but it actually turns out it is a thriving contemporary theater. Isn't that exciting? Currently more than 1,400 professional shitehata. It has a living history, oral visceral tradition of over 650 years. It's an unbroken tradition, which makes it very unique in world theater. And performance practices are ever evolving. I think the first time I encountered No in a theater textbook, the impression I came away with was that it was some kind of a preserved museum piece. It certainly is not. But this is important because that gives certain context for the work that Theatre Nohgaku is doing. It's possible perhaps to see the efforts of the company as part of a continuum as opposed to some strange aberration. So that's No as it's practiced. No, what is it? Again, some things which may seem kind of obvious, but they have important implications. It is a combination of poetry, music, and dance. And because it's these 3 things that creates the necessity of composition and writing, also the necessity of training, which cannot be overstated. It is repertory based, which means training takes a long time because you have to learn a lot before you could be a professional in No, which I'm not. That it has a formal structure, but it's made of movable parts. And one of the things that's difficult, definitely for me in approaching this form, is understanding when those parts could be moved reasonably and when No, they can't. There are some combinations that are possible, practical in No, and there are some that just would not. Right? You wouldn't end with a nanori, for example. This last point I want to develop a little bit, that No as an art is heavily marked in that it reads very, I'm not sure whether to actually, I guess I'll just go like this. It reads very differently to a connoisseur than it does to a novice. And to illustrate this point, using a different kind of art, a connoisseurship and the ability to recognize aesthetic and situational markers. So, raise your hand if you know what sport this is. Yes, yes, okay. Raise your hand if you know what position that player is playing. Okay, a few, not quite as many hands. Raise your hand if you know the team he plays for. Only 3 hands. You see the hands are dwindling down. So the levels of connoisseurship are boxing people out. Tell me if you know the actual name of this person. Okay, we're done. If you're a Detroit Red Wings fan, then you'd know it right away. So clearly, a connoisseur approaching any kind of an art is getting passively a whole pile of information just through their habitual engagement in that art than someone coming to it for the first time. So similarly, if we look at this picture, which sort of serendipitously ends up looking sort of like the first one, a newcomer to the art is going to see one thing, but a connoisseur to the art, with just that one snapshot, is going to know, first of all, the type of play it is. They're going to recognize the particular mask. They're going to recognize, they'll know the season that the play is set in based on the patterns of the kimono, etc. So this idea of aesthetic markers that identify a piece is something I want you to hang on to as we take a look at Noh and Western performing artists. And this is a really quick overview just to give you some sense, again, of how I think Theatre Nohgaku is doing something that is different than anything I had encountered before when I first reached. I think there are some other groups who are maybe approaching this work now, I understand from Diago's presentation. But going back to 2000, I think Tien was really doing something, or proposing something quite unique. So Western involvement in Noh goes back, quite a bit, at least 100 years. Ernst van Lossa and Ezra Pound, of course, and their work inspired W.B. Yeats and others. W.B. Yeats was very much interested in sort of a poetic drama and symbolism, and he saw in Noh a relationship of text to story, you might say, that was something that he wanted to try to replicate in his plays. And he wrote these plays, 4 plays for dancers. He was able to he was introduced to a young Japanese dancer who was not trained in Noh, but who happened to be hanging out in London. And they actually did production. Now, you could see this is not possible in Noh, right? You know right away this is not, this separation of legs. So we know right away that this, in terms of Noh movement kata, they're creating a play that was not Noh in that sense, right? It was inspired perhaps by Noh in a second-hand way. Also, of course, mentioned yesterday, I believe, is the translations by Arthur Waley, which came via Waley into German to Bertolt Brecht. And he was also very moved by aspects of Noh that furthered his own agenda for this idea of detachment, the Verfremdungseffekt, probably pronouncing that wrong. So he found in Noh a sort of a marker of performance that he wanted to emulate and develop. Similarly, some of you may recognize Benjamin Britten. He saw a production of Sumidagawa in Tokyo, and he was very moved by the production. And one of the things that struck him, again, another aesthetic marker, is the relationship of the instrumentation to a conductor, because there is no conductor in Noh. Or rather, the role of conductor is sort of a fluid thing that gets exchanged among members of the ensemble. And so he built into his score the opportunity for different members of the ensemble to take the lead and have others follow. And I'll give one, and this is the play, the opera that he did, Curlew River. One more example, so you wouldn't recognize this person, David Byrne of the Talking Heads, was also very struck by Noh, and he visited Japan, and he got his idea of the big coat from Noh. So the reason, I just borrowing a few examples to suggest that there is quite a history that preceded us of people latching onto particular situational markers or aesthetic markers of Noh. And those markers could be textual, they could be a musical phrase, they could be whatever. That's not exactly what we're trying to do with Theatre Nohgaku. Theatre Nohgaku's mission is a little bit different. The goal of the company, as it's stated on our website, is actually to share No's beauty and power with English-speaking audiences and performers. In that sense, what we're really trying to do, and this shocked me, the first time I had a chance to really talk to Richard Emmert, before I really knew him, he mentioned to me something about this company, Theatre Nohgaku. And I had seen some No, but I didn't really know much about it. And my first thought was, why would you do that? Why? I honestly didn't, and it wasn't really until some years later. I have to say, when I was invited to perform for the first time with Tien, I jumped at it. I was really hungry to do something like that. And the first time I sat in a chorus and I heard the drum patterns while singing, while trying to channel the voice of the jigashira, all of a sudden, I wouldn't say that I understood the art all at once, but there was a kinetic, visceral experience of the art that I'd never had before. And the power of language and its association with the drum calls, the drums themselves, the kata, etc. Hearing English and actually singing it at the same time as seeing these things, for the first time, No made sense in a really visceral way for me. So I want to actually just take a couple of quotes from members of the company, actually our two most venerable and most experienced members, Mr. Emmert, who's here, and also David Crandall. These are quotes that I heard both of them say, and Rick, please correct me if I'm off here. But I remember Rick talking about his desire to find a way to express the beauty and power of No through the rhythms of his native language. So by the time Theatre Nohgaku, and actually before Theatre Nohgaku was formed, Rick had already been studying No for a long time. And the idea was sort of common that No could only be done in Japanese. And yet, once he felt he had the rhythms in his body, it seemed like a very natural next step to perform in English. So this impulse is what broke us free from the stricture that No has to be in Japanese. The second quote by David Crandall was actually spoken at a pre-show talk in Oxford in 2009. He said that No is a human art which happened to be discovered by the Japanese, which kind of that view frees us from the notion that we don't have a right to engage in this art, to tell our own stories. So Theatre Nohgaku essentially is a proposition which is buoyed by these two assumptions. And if you reject one of those assumptions, then you will reject us, which is fine. But it's worth at least exploring. One thing in common of all of our membership is that training in No, in actual No, to the greatest degree we can with a Japanese master, or a master who has trained in Japan, that is the foundation and the point of departure of the work that we want to do. In other words, we're not interested in just making something kind of No-like, borrowing a little bit of this and a little bit of that. We're actually trying to let that be the starting point so that there is a capacity that is created. There are possibilities that are created through the training. And in terms of its outward expression, there are some times when we have performed on those stages, or we have a provisional stage that we set up which is meant to establish the space of a No stage. We've also, much less often, but more recently in Boston, we performed in a theater, the Psy Center in Boston, in which we messed with, and we actually used a set designer, and we kind of messed with the structure of a No stage, but keeping the training in No as a foundation for the movement, for the utai, etc. Okay, so that's sort of that's just a starting point, just a kind of a larger overview of where I think that Theatre Nohgaku fits into the larger world of Western artists engaging in No. So from here, I'm going to pass you to Laura, who is going to deal with one area of a practical concern, and that is our training. How do we train, especially if we live in the UK, or in Massachusetts, or in California, and we don't have a teacher nearby us? How do we manage that? So Laura. Oh, and by the way, in terms of questions, we're going to try to take questions at the end of this first set after Rick's presentation, and then again after the last set. So just 2 times. Okay? So I give you Laura.